For centuries, cavalry decided wars. Speed, shock, and maneuver transformed battlefield victories into total collapse. And in 1914, every major European army was convinced the horse would do it again. The next war was expected to be fast, fluid, and decisive, shaped by movement rather than attrition. Doctrine, tradition, and confidence all pointed in the same direction. Cavalry still ruled the battlefield. Then the war began, and the battlefield delivered a brutal contradiction. Firepower surged ahead of mobility. Movement became lethal. What had defined dominance for generations now produced instant punishment. Courage could not outrun bullets, and the space cavalry needed to operate began to disappear. How did an arm of war that dominated Europe for centuries collapse in a matter of days? And why did its failure come as such a shock to the men who planned the war? To unswear that, we first need to go back to the world before 1914, when the horse still made perfect sense. Before 1914, cavalry represented the decisive arm of warfare across Europe. Mounted troops delivered speed, shock, and operational reach unmatched by infantry. On open terrain, cavalry could scout ahead, exploit flanks, pursue broken enemies, and transform battlefield success into strategic collapse. These roles were not symbolic. They were grounded in centuries of experience, where human and animal muscle defined battlefield mobility. As long as movement remained limited to marching soldiers and horse-drawn logistics, cavalry occupied a logical and indispensable position within military systems, shaping planning, command culture, and expectations about how wars should be fought and won historically. By the late 19th century, this logic still dominated military thinking. European armies expected future wars to be short, fluid, and decided by rapid maneuver rather than prolonged attrition. Pre-war doctrine assumed that mass armies would clash, lines would break, and mobile forces would exploit openings. Cavalry units were therefore trained extensively for reconnaissance, screening, pursuit, and exploitation. Officers believed that offensive spirit, discipline, and courage could overcome most battlefield obstacles. This mindset encouraged continuity with tradition, reinforcing confidence that cavalry would remain relevant despite incremental technological changes. Occurring before 1914 across the continent in military planning circles everywhere, technology before the war appeared evolutionary rather than revolutionary. Horses remained the primary source of operational mobility, hauling artillery, supplies, and troops across Europe. Although machine guns and rapid-firing artillery existed, their full battlefield implications were widely underestimated. Many planners believed these weapons would support offensive action rather than fundamentally reshape it. Firepower increased, but mobility did not appear to lag dangerously behind, because cavalry had adapted successfully to previous innovations, such as rifled firearms. Military institutions assumed adaptation would continue, blinding them to the approaching imbalance between fire and movement on future battlefields of modern war thinking broadly. Beyond practicality, cavalry was embedded deeply within military culture. Cavalry officers formed social elites, shaping command hierarchies and institutional values. Horsemanship symbolized leadership, honor, and decisiveness, reinforcing emotional attachment to mounted warfare. This cultural weight mattered because doctrine is not only technical but psychological. As long as cavalry embodied confidence and control, questioning its relevance felt like questioning military identity itself. Consequently, warning signs produced by industrial firepower were rationalized or minimized. Tradition provided reassurance, delaying recognition that battlefield conditions were changing faster than inherited concepts could accommodate across European armies and doctrine debates, and strategic education systems universally. Thus, on the eve of the First World War, cavalry appeared rational, proven, and indispensable. Strategic assumptions, cultural identity, and technological misjudgment converged to preserve faith in the horse. Armies did not enter the conflict blindly nostalgic, but logically committed to a model that had worked repeatedly in previous wars. The tragedy was not ignorance, but timing. Industrialized firepower was about to accelerate beyond the limits of biological mobility. When that acceleration collided with cavalry on the battlefield, the rupture would be immediate, visible, and impossible to ignore, according to contemporary observers and later historical analysis of the conflict itself. If cavalry still made perfect sense in theory, what exactly happened when theory met the reality of industrial war? World War I did not phase out cavalry. It exposed its limits in days. In 1914, armies still pictured sweeping maneuvers and meeting engagements, with mounted troops racing to scout, screen, and exploit. Then the battlefield delivered a shock. Firepower had surged ahead of mobility. Rifles, machine guns, and rapid-firing artillery created a tempo and lethality that a horse could not outrun. In the classic balance of fire and maneuver, fire suddenly dominated, and any movement in the open became a gamble with instant punishment. Commanders learned that courage and tradition could not change the physics of bullets. That imbalance surfaced during the first clashes, when attempted maneuver drew grim tolls, and troops realized survival on the surface was nearly impossible. With no open flanks to turn, growing force density pressed armies into narrow corridors of exposure. The answer was a spade. By the end of 1914, the Western Front hardened into parallel lines of foxholes and trenches from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Cavalry's defining advantages: speed, shock. Pursuit required space. Trenches, wire, and continuous fronts removed that space and replaced it with measured killing zones. In such conditions, a charge became arithmetic, not romance. Mounted units often had to dismount and fight as infantry because the battlefield punished visibility more than it rewarded speed. Even where cavalry appeared, it was frequently reduced to messaging, screening, or holding ground rather than decisive breakthrough. Later narratives point to spectacular actions like the Australian light horse at Beersheba and the Canadian cavalry at Wood, where sabres were drawn and objectives taken under fire. Yet these episodes worked only when terrain was open, surprise held, and defenses were thin, conditions the Western Front usually denied. They proved cavalry could still function, but only inside rare windows. Officers and analysts began recognizing the deeper issue. War itself had shifted paradigms. The conflict was becoming, in effect, the first mechanized war, where machines and massed fire shaped outcomes more than blood and muscle. Horses still hauled guns and supplies, but their days as the primary motive force were clearly numbered by 1918. This did not happen all at once. Railways and engines had started the transition earlier, but World War I pushed it into maturity, and cavalry's reliance on animal mobility placed it on the wrong side of history. The battlefield's logic was impersonal and industrial. Seen from the trenches, the verdict felt obvious. Maneuver in the face of overwhelming fire became almost suicidal, and cavalry was simply the clearest victim of that fact. Commanders kept searching for ways to return to the natural condition of maneuver warfare, but they were trying to restore an old model after the central paradigm had already shifted. When cavalry rode forward, it met wire, craters, and interlocking fire. When it waited behind the lines, it became irrelevant. In practice, everyone could see the horse had lost its battlefield job. The Great War made that recognition truly permanent. As the war dragged on, attempts to rescue cavalry doctrine only highlighted its obsolescence. Commanders experimented with better coordination, tighter control, and more cautious employment. Yet none of these measures restored cavalry's decisive role. The problem was never technique alone. Firepower continued to grow, while mobility remained biologically constrained. Artillery dominated the battlefield, delivering destruction and neutralization far beyond the line of sight. Machine guns locked down sectors with sustained fire. In this environment, cavalry could not exploit success, because success itself could not move faster than the guns defending against it. The contrast between fronts reinforced this conclusion. On the Western Front, cavalry was sidelined almost immediately, because continuous defenses and fire density eliminated maneuver space. On the Eastern Front, and in the Middle East, where terrain was wider and defenses thinner, mounted forces retained limited relevance. Yet even there, cavalry success depended on conditions that industrial warfare steadily eroded. Geography did not save cavalry. It merely delayed its eclipse. Wherever modern firepower concentrated, cavalry's vulnerability was exposed again. The horse required space, and modern war increasingly consumed it. This realization pushed armies towards substitutes rather than reforms. Infantry tactics evolved, emphasizing infiltration, dispersion, and initiative. Artillery doctrine shifted from long destruction to carefully timed neutralization. Most importantly, mechanization emerged as the answer to the mobility crisis. Tanks represented a direct response to the failure of mounted movement. They crossed trenches, crushed wire, and absorbed fire that would annihilate cavalry. Although early tanks were unreliable, their conceptual importance was unmistakable. By 1918, the transition from animal muscle to machine power had become irreversible on the modern battlefield. Crucially, this was not the death of cavalry's underlying logic. The need for reconnaissance, exploitation, pursuit, and rapid concentration of force did not disappear. What vanished was the horse's ability to perform those tasks under industrial conditions. Cavalry units increasingly adapted, combining mounted traditions with armored cars, tanks, and motorized transport. The term cavalry survived, but its meaning changed. Speed and shock were preserved, yet now delivered by engines, armor, and coordinated fire rather than hooves and sabers. Continuity existed at the conceptual level, not the biological one. Cultural resistance slowed this acceptance. Many senior officers were cavalrymen by identity, shaped by horsemanship and tradition. Horses symbolized leadership, honor, and continuity with the past. Letting go felt like surrendering not just a weapon, but a worldview. This emotional attachment explains why cavalry lingered institutionally even as its battlefield role collapsed. Yet evidence accumulated relentlessly. By the war's end, few doubted the verdict delivered by experience. Horses remained indispensable for logistics and transport, but not for decisive combat. World War I therefore stands as the moment when cavalry's obsolescence became undeniable. The collapse was visible, immediate, and widely understood. It was not a failure of men, but of a platform overtaken by industrial firepower. The battlefield itself delivered the judgment. Cavalry did not fade quietly into a it was confronted, tested, and defeated by a new form of war. In Tatsensi, the Great War did not merely end an era. It announced, with brutal clarity, that the age of the horse as a decisive instrument of battle was over forever. World War I did not mark the failure of cavalry as an idea, but the end of the horse as a decisive instrument of modern war. The conflict revealed, with unprecedented clarity, that warfare had crossed a technological threshold. Industrial firepower transformed the battlefield into an environment where exposed mobility could no longer survive. Machine guns, artillery, and dense defensive systems reshaped combat into a contest of coordination, protection, and sustained fire. In this new reality, traditional cavalry was not merely inefficient, it was structurally incompatible with modern war. The resistance to this conclusion was not intellectual alone, but deeply cultural. Cavalry represented centuries of military identity, prestige, and leadership. Many senior commanders were shaped by mounted service and struggled to abandon a worldview that had defined their careers. This attachment explains why cavalry lingered institutionally, even as battlefield evidence mounted. Horses continued to serve bravely and indispensably in logistics, transport, and support roles. Yet their era as agents of shock and decision had passed. The war did not destroy cavalry through incompetence, but through exposure to a battlefield it was never designed to face. Crucially, the logic of cavalry survived its platform. Speed, exploitation, reconnaissance, and pursuit remained essential functions in warfare. What changed was the means of delivering them. Tanks, armored vehicles, and motorized formations inherited cavalry's role, providing the protection and firepower necessary to operate under industrial conditions. This transition was not accidental. It was a direct response to the failure of animal mobility under modern fire. By 1918, the foundations of mechanized warfare were firmly in place, shaping conflicts for the next century. In hindsight, the First World War stands as a clear historical breakpoint. Cavalry did not decline slowly across decades. It was confronted suddenly and decisively. Soldiers, officers, and observers recognized this transformation as it unfolded. The battlefield delivered an unmistakable verdict that required no theoretical justification. Traditional cavalry had reached the limits of its usefulness. The horse remained, but its dominance did not. In that moment, warfare moved irreversibly into the modern age, leaving behind not the spirit of cavalry, but the world that had once allowed it to rule.